stacking, tracking, or slacking. Let's talk about the 3 different ways that most people shoot Milky Way landscape photography, and let's figure out which one might be best for you. Hello, friends. It is Tim Little. I am a nighttime landscape artist living on the east coast of Massachusetts on Cape Cod. When I say Milky Way landscape photography or astro landscape photography, which is another way people refer to it, this is the type of thing I am talking about. So essentially you have a great foreground composition and it is topped with the Milky Way. And that is how I typically shoot. To me, the foreground is important and it needs to stand independent of the sky. So in other words, I could change the Milky Way out with clouds or moonlight or star trails, and I'm still going to have a solid composition. One thing I want to be absolutely clear about before I get into this is the expectation or the understanding that, like you, I don't shoot for NASA. I'm not imaging for NASA. And why do I say that? Because there does seem to be an obsession with the star trails. I can't get any star trails in there. I can't shoot for more than 3 seconds. I got all these rules I got to follow. A lot of gateway stuff or gatekeeping things that you don't really need to worry about for a couple of reasons. One is I treat this like art. So when I tell you about these things, I'm thinking about it from an artistic standpoint, not from a NASA archival standpoint. That seems like a very heavy weight to put on yourself for really no reason. Not to mention the fact that, let's face it, most of the times that our work is being looked at is on something this size, on Instagram, on Facebook. Now, yes, you may print your work occasionally, and then the larger you print it, the more the viewing distance increases. Then that's a whole nother video. But don't worry so much about the pixel peeping and the star trailing. I think, and I've said this before, night photography is one of the most over-engineered forms of photography I've seen, specifically because people get so in their head about trying to be perfectionists when it comes to these things that nobody else is going to notice. And quite frankly, when you look at your own photos in the same format that a lot of other people do, on tiny screens, they could even be a little out of focus and it's not going to matter, which means that if you have an extra second or two of exposure time resulting in some star trailing, you may notice when you blow it up to its tiniest pixel, that's okay. It's not a big deal. We're going to do nice, balanced compositions with nice foregrounds that are properly exposed and Milky Ways that look good. And that's the criteria. The first technique that I'm going to talk about is called the slacking technique. And I call it that. Nobody else calls it that, so don't look it up. But by comparison to the other two, I think it's the easiest because you can just do it in one exposure. So you go out with your camera and you want to expose for the Milky Way, ISO 3200, nice wide aperture like f2.8, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 to 30 seconds, depending on how wide angle your lens is. A lot of my earlier Milky Way work I shot at 14 millimeters, and I did for about 30 seconds because I just wanted to get a little bit extra light in there, and I never really worried about the trailing too much and was always happy with what I got in that aspect. Of course, if you are going to shoot the Milky Way in a nice dark environment, which of course is what you want, far away from light pollution, you're going to have a really underexposed foreground using those settings. And that's why it's important for you to bring some sort of lighting tool with you, whether it's like the Proto Machine, which I've talked about in the past, or a flashlight with a nice diffuser, just to give your foreground that little bump. What you do not want to do is just expose from the Milky Way, go home, and then expect to boost that in post, because having seen a lot of that online, I can tell you that it never ends well. It ends up being grainy and sandy, and it just doesn't look good. So do yourself a favor and just bring a light and help your photo out. If you do it properly, it's one shot. You'll bring it home, you'll throw it in Lightroom, maybe you'll do a little bit brushing around the Milky Way and some contrast, but overall, it's a pretty solid way to get a good shot. I think the two main drawbacks to doing it this particular way is, one, the higher ISO, which I hinted on. Some cameras just don't do well with higher ISO. If that's the case, one of the other techniques I'm going to tell you about may work better. The other thing, and it's a trap that I see people fall into, is they say, oh, I got a nice wide aperture lens and I can do 1.4 or f2 or 1.8 to kind of trim down my ISO and offset that. I'll do that. Well, guess what? A lot of lenses, the wider you go, don't do well with the stars in the corner. They start to get soft. They get coma, which are these flat looking stars. The colors might be diffringed. It just ends up being a mess. And in a lot of cases, it's not something you can fix. So I, for that reason, rarely will shoot below f2.8 on my primary lens. I do have a lens that'll stop down to 1.4, and I find that it's good down to about f2 before I start seeing those weird corners. So my advice to you is know your camera's ISO capabilities, and 2, test out your wide aperture lenses at different aperture settings so you can decide whether or not you like the corners on that lens. Okay, the next technique number 2, is commonly referred to as the stacking technique. This is something that will really help folks out there who have older cameras that they don't want to get rid of. Older Canon Rebels, Nikon D5000 series, 7000s. The cameras that do really great and have aged really well to shoot everything. But when it comes to doing higher ISO photography, like what we're doing here, they kind of fall apart, especially in editing. You'll go out and you'll use the same settings we mentioned earlier. Use a higher ISO. Don't be afraid of it. Use a wide aperture and use 25 or 30 seconds, whatever you're comfortable with. And instead of taking one shot, you're going to take 8 to 10. You want to take them all in a row in quick succession so you don't get a lot of sky movement. This will come in handy later. And one of those shots should be your foreground. Do not forget about the foreground. Give it a little bit of lighting, because just like before, you want to make sure that you have enough to work with, and that lighting is going to help you bring out the color and that nice balanced exposure. When you're done, you're going to go home and you're going to take all of those images and you're going to, guess what, stack them in software like Sequitur or Starry Landscape Stacker. There's a plethora of software out there available for you. And what that's going to do is smush those images together and average all the noise out to give you a much cleaner image than you would have had you tried it in a single shot. And this is, I don't want to use the term game changer. Everything's a game changer now. But it is a huge boost. It's a huge benefit, this technique. Yes, it requires more shots in the field. Yes, it requires more post-production, not a lot more. If you've got a computer that can think rather quickly, this won't take long at all. But it gives you this incredible benefit of having images that are much more clean than you would have otherwise, and can really breathe life into these older cameras that you may have decided, I'm not going to do any night shooting that way because the ISO is terrible on this. Well, not anymore. The reason I mentioned earlier to make sure you take those shots in quick succession, in other words, not waiting a lot of time between them, is because this software, whatever software you're using, it's going to take those images and merge them together, but also account for motion within reason. So in other words, you really don't want to take a few shots, then take a phone call, talk for 15 minutes, and then go back to taking your series, because now too much time has gone by. Remember, that software has to account for not only the motion of the sky, but also has to blend your horizon in. And the more motion you have, the harder that's going to be for your software, which is why you don't want to leave any unnecessary time between shots. Technique number 3 is my favorite. It is my go-to currently, and that is the tracking technique. Now, it does require a piece of hardware to make it happen properly, but it is very rewarding and it gives you a lot of benefits. The other techniques we talked about utilize aperture and ISO to their maximum potential because time is the weakest link. Go too long, you get start trails that are obvious. You don't want that. What if time was no longer a factor? What if you could harness the power of time and not so much worry about aperture or ISO? If you could do that, what that would mean to you is your kit lens that only stops down to f4.5 is fine now. Your camera maybe doesn't need to do higher than ISO 800, which means you're going to have really clean images and potentially better color. And your camera will track the sky as long as it needs to. Here's what you need. Either a Pentax type camera, like what I have, the Pentax K1, which has a tracker built in. It essentially moves the sensor with the sky. Or There are a lot of different units that you can put on the bottom of your camera, right where it mounts to the tripod, and then mount that together onto the tripod. You're sandwiching it in between, and that will move your whole camera to track with the sky. It is the most technically complex in the field. I don't mean to say technically complex in a scary way. It just means it requires some setup. When you get there, here's a post-processing safety tip if you're going to use this technique. When you're done doing your track shot of the sky, I usually do that first. Then you're going to switch over to the foreground. There might be a temptation to change your settings so that you can get a proper foreground exposure. Don't. Bring a light, use the light instead. That's the theme of all these techniques, is have a light to help out your foreground. Here's why. If you decide to change any of your settings for your foreground shot and then try to blend that later, you could end up with some very weird artifacting or some really strange artificial looking blending due to the fact that the settings don't match, and the software may have a little bit of a hard time with that. Light pollution is something we deal a lot with in just about every location facing every horizon. So if you have light pollution that is brighter in one area, a light dome that's brighter in one area in one shot because of a changed setting, trying to blend those later and having stars within those just turns into kind of a pain in the butt and a fairly ugly mess, and you won't be happy. Or you may have a camera that just does a fantastic job of dynamic range, bringing up those shadowy areas. And if that's the case, then you're in good shape. But try to keep those settings the same, and I think you'll be happier with how much easier it is to do the blending. So there you go. Slacking, stacking, tracking. Which one is the right one? Only you can answer that question. They are all great. They will all give you good images. The decision as to what is best for you is up to you. Depends on your gear. It depends on how much post-processing you want to do. And it really just depends on your goals. I love the tracking technique, but I have the technology for that. I think most people will be very happy with stacking if they have the technology available in terms of the software and the computing power. And if you're crunched for time and you got a light and you got the right aperture and a good ISO camera, just go out and do it in one shot. You'll be totally happy with it. Just remember, you don't have to over-engineer any of this. I said it at the beginning. I'm going to say it again. You're not photographing for NASA archival imagery. This is art. It should be fun, and it's all about getting outside and enjoying the beautiful night sky that we have access to at our locations. I hope you found this helpful. If there is a technique that you use that is different, let me know in the comments. If you've done any one of these before and you've been happy, let me know that too. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I thank you for watching.